Welcome to Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. Today, I am chatting with Professor Deb Donig about ethical and human technology. Deb is a professor of English literature at Cal Poly, a lecturer at UC Berkeley School of Information, a fellow at the Cal Poly Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and the host of the Technically Human podcast. She has also recently been appointed as a Siegel Family Endowment Research Fellow for All Tech is Human. Welcome, Deb. I'm so delighted to have you on board.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me. This is a pleasure and really looking forward to the conversation today.
Deb, before we get started and going into your research and your work, can you tell me a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and what inspired your interest in exploring the intersection of technology, ethics, and human rights?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I went into academia, I actually worked in the context of both technology startups as well as human rights. And when I went to into academia, I really wanted to explore questions of human rights a little bit further. I got my doctorate in English literature, looking at the evolution of a way of talking about human rights over the 20th century. And my first professorship, I was at a polytechnic university. Cal Poly is a polytechnic university primarily. And one of my first weeks there, I was sitting down with a bunch of undergraduates, and one of those undergraduates was an engineering computer science major. And when I told him what I did, he said, "Oh, I don't need to take any classes on human rights or ethics or anything like that. I got everything I needed to know in high school." And I thought, and this is the problem. The problem being what I had seen prior to going into academia, prior to starting my professorship, which is that so many of the products that have built-in flaws or cause harms emerge out of cultures where people are not trained to think about those harms, where they think that they are just a technologist or just an engineer, that they're just coding something, that they're just producing a piece of hardware. But of course, what we produce in terms of our tools are the outcomes of the design and the concept of those tools. And as a professor of English literature, trained to think about stories and trained to think about how we tell stories in particular, I like to say that before we can build anything, we first have to imagine it. It matters what stories we tell ourselves about what we're doing and where we want to go. The technologies that we build frequently are sold to us as building a better world or moving us toward a better world. What do we mean by a better world? How are our technologies getting there? And in the cases where we're being sold a story, what do we need in terms of tools in order to be able to decipher whether or not these technologies are actually moving us toward the world that we want to build, the world that we want to live in? And so my vision for building responsible technology flourished at Cal Poly, where I opened up a center on ethics and technology, started talking to a diversity of thinkers about that, because one principal belief I have is that it matters who gets to do the imagining as well. And moving forward from that, I started to create a constellation of thinkers and ideas at that intersection, and really want to build a new pipeline, a new vision for education that helps trains not only engineers, but people who have backgrounds in humanities to take up this kind of work in the tech industry, uh, and to ultimately create a responsible technology ecosystem from education to the ultimate flourishing of those individuals in the industry itself.
It sounds as though, as individuals, whatever we do in technology, we need kind of a bit more of a holistic viewpoint. So each of us knowing where we fit into the system and how we fit into the system. But also, I like the way you say the story we tell ourselves, but it's kind of the narrative that we have in our worldview makes a huge difference in terms of how we approach technology and the ethics around technology.
Yeah, for me, I think that the problems that we're facing in the 21st century and that we're likely to face over the next decades and over the next century are problems that are just too big to be solved by any one discipline. COVID, for example, was a public health issue. It was an issue of science, but it was also a question of psychology. It was also a question of sociology. It was also a question of, increasingly in the United States, politics, right? It was a question of culture. In order to grapple with how to mitigate the harms of a COVID virus, we had to understand how people were navigating questions of their own health, how the history of ideas and the history of pandemics and the history of vaccines and the history of how people understood their own responsibility and obligations to other people in society worked. And so this really, I think, is a case example of how important it is to have a diversity of intellectual approaches to this problem. Data, right, is a question, of course, and this is what I teach at Berkeley, of how we decide to count things. But it also is a question of what we think matters in the first place to count, right? It's a question of how we make categories about and out of the inchoate world that we live in, such that we know what we should be counting and how we allot that item into a broad array of different possibilities of how something should be counted. I like to say, following the thinker Deborah Stone, that to count, of course, means to quantify with numbers. That's how we typically use it in data science. But when we say something counts, it also means that we think something matters. So to count means both to measure or to quantify with numbers and also to matter. How do we decide what matters to begin with? That's not a question that you will solve using a mathematical formula. That's a question that you solve using philosophy or sociology.
And you have a podcast called Technically Human. What motivated you to start the podcast? And who is your main audience and what impact do you hope it has on your listeners?
Sure. I started that show in 2020. I had just gotten my first research award to study the responsible tech ecosystem. And one of the things I had proposed is creating opportunities for thinkers to convene together and to talk about the intersection of ethics and technology. I think that I have some smart instincts, but I am smart enough, I think, to also know where my instincts don't have full command of ideas. And so my view is always that when I want to learn more about an idea, I go and I reach out to the expert. I talk to somebody who's better informed than I am. And so one of the visions of the convention idea or the convening idea I had in that particular moment, what I wanted to use that time and that money for was to collect people thinking about these ideas from a broad panoply of positions and bring them together to deliberate the ideas and to come to a consensus, given that deliberation, about what perspectives it's important to include and how people from a multitude of different positions are thinking about an issue. And of course, COVID happened right in that moment. I wasn't able to do that. And I had never hosted a podcast before. I had no familiarity with it. I did not understand the massive undertaking that I was undertaking. But I really did want to talk to that variety of folks. And so I reimagined that convening as a podcast series, hoping that I could do, the first 10 podcasts and that would suffice. And then the podcast really took off. I grew a large audience first in the United States, and then internationally. And now at this stage, the podcast is taught in a variety of different curricula around the world as an opportunity to engage in conversations. And my vision for the show was really to create a constellation of a diversity of perspectives where people who are thinking about this issue from a variety of different positions, not just, for example, in digital technologies, but also in food technologies and also in, technologies around disability, for example, could get together so that we could see the wide circumference of all of the areas in which responsible and ethical approaches are at stake when it comes to technology. And my hope and my view of the show moving forward is that my primary audience, that is to say, I like to think of them as smart undergraduates, will continue to want to learn, to be curious, and to have those conversations at some stage themselves.
Where can someone listen to or watch your podcast?
We are called Technically Human. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Brilliant. And how long are the shows normally?
They run usually between about 50 minutes and in some cases an hour and a half. Depends on how broad and how good of a conversation I'm having. And when I say good, I just want to clarify, I don't mean that I'm really enjoying the conversation, or that I think that the conversation is with somebody who agrees with my positions. Good can also mean that I'm talking to people with whom I really disagree, and I want to get to the heart of that disagreement and provide listeners with an opportunity to see how people who have different positions on an issue can work through their differences using the techniques and the strategies of civil discourse to disagree with one one another politely, adversarially, but also with genuine curiosity and an attempt to know and find truth, rather than what we see so frequently, I think, in our media diet today, which is discourse primarily served to showcase opposition and the fomentation of uh, disagreement, leading to I think, frequently uncivil discourse. That's not my job, and that's not how I see um, my vision of conversation generally. So a good conversation for me can be with two thinkers who hold anti-regulatory views, and which is something that I oppose. A good conversation can be with somebody who's building a technology that I actually think is probably not a good idea, but that is a technology that's getting built and that I want to know more about and that I want to have an opportunity to query and see where we disagree and where we agree, where we hold the same uh, uh, premises and axioms and where we don't.
So that's really what education is about, isn't it? It's about getting to the truth in matter and having those good conversations, even and especially when you disagree with someone, because that's when you really find out the nub of what you believe as well. Having to argue your point of view or put across in a way that is sound.
Ideally, yes. Ideally, yes. I think that that's happening less and less frequently. In social media context, I think we see very frequently people who don't have a strongly informed opinion just telling somebody else that they're an idiot, or people talking at cross purposes with one another with the aim of dunking somebody or taking them down. In academia, I think more frequently than I'd like to see happen, people are, I think, induced to take ideological positions that they do not want challenged. And I think that academia is becoming, sadly, increasingly ideological and increasingly militant in that ideology, and increasingly, I think, from a pedagogical perspective, that does not serve the fundamental principles, I think, of pure inquiry and civil discourse. I would much rather see somebody in my classes pr disagree with me in a principled way than me, for example, say, this is a course on my political opinions and everybody's here to repeat back to me and ultimately master my political opinions. I like to say that above and beyond any particular policy position I hold, my primary obligation, my primary value, and what I teach, I hope, in and above any subject matter is the principle of how we dialogue with one another, how we agree and how we disagree with one another, as well as how we really come to know and understand what we know. To bring this back into the realm of technology, one of the things that I fear that our generative AI platforms may allow us to ultimately lose is the idea that writing, for example, is not a product of thought. It's actually the process of thinking. And as a psychologist working at the intersection of how the mind works and technology, you are probably familiar with these ideas that the basis of writing is this idea that we have this dense thought cloud in our mind, these inchoate thoughts that haven't given form to themselves yet. And what we do when we speak to somebody else, when we ideally then write down what we think and have the opportunity to scrutinize it further with editing, is we take that dense thought cloud and we push it out through the crucible of shared language, such that we have to give our thoughts linearity, we have to give them vocabulary, we have to give them some precision that we don't need to give them when they exist in our mind. And once they get passed through that crucible, ideally, they also get through the scrutiny of our own distance from those thoughts as they exit our head. And then, more ideally, the scrutiny of somebody else, preferably somebody who disagrees with us, who can give it maximal scrutiny so that we can really see where our logical jumps are, where maybe we don't have our facts exactly right, where maybe there is some uh, incoherence between what we have laid out and our basic axioms, right? Or beliefs. And so that scrutiny and that process of articulating what we believe to be true is the process of reifying and providing that scrutiny and finally becoming conscious of what we actually believe. That's what writing is. My concern is that if you just type in a prompt to ChatGPT and you get an output of what something that looks like writing, you take a shortcut through that path. And that is a lost opportunity, I believe, to really understand how and what we think.
I'd love to come back to Gen AI a little later in our conversation, but I want to kind of flip back to something you originally spoke about when you're introducing yourself in a conversation we had during our initial chat, when you mentioned that you originally worked in Silicon Valley as an entrepreneur, but then switched to academia. Can you talk a bit more about this journey and what you now do as a professor of English technology at Berkeley?
Yeah, when I was working in Silicon Valley, it was about 2008. To think back to that moment, that it's most famously characterized by being the moment in the United States of the financial crisis. And it was a moment in Silicon Valley where the early dot-com kind of boost that the industry had gotten was meeting for the really the first time some serious venture capital. And what I saw in that moment is that some of the formative technologies that had been developed in that prior decade had flourished and flourished and done so well financially that many people who would have otherwise been, for example, a uh, you know, financially successful person on Wall Street, we're now coming to Silicon Valley. So you can think of it, and I oftentimes think of this as the new gold rush. The old gold rush in the United States had to do with people coming out, leaving their professions behind to come pan for gold, as California was newly discovered to be a place where the streets were paved with gold. That was what San Francisco at the time it was famous for. Well, in 2008, the word got out that California streets were paved with gold again, and people came out, left their professions to seek their fortune. And that was a moment where I think the initial vision of building technologies that were going to change the world, that were going to be really exciting, was then motivated in a different direction by people who said, let's build a technology because it'll be profitable. Venture capitalists who said, let's put our money in here because there's a profit to be made. And the movement away from technologies where at least the vision, if not the ultimate effect, was changing the world for the better, moved to changing the world in order for me to make a profit. And that's what I saw in that particular moment. The culture really changed as a new influx of people from industries primarily oriented around making money, mobilized out west and galvanized that new industry in that direction. And I, as somebody who had grown up really believing in the cause of human rights, who'd spent the past couple of years working on human rights and really wanted that old version of Silicon Valley. I grew up in the Bay Area, and that's what I had understood Silicon Valley to fundamentally be about. Um, I saw that fading, and participating in it, I just saw how the infrastructure supported that profit motive and even moved people who were interested in developing technologies that were going to be fundamentally good toward what I call mission drift, which is when your original concept and your original company gets an influx of cash or support or becomes beholden to financial backers. And then your original motivation and your original mission statement pivots toward the direction in which you will be able to make money. That's what I saw happening. And I saw how much that affected the culture. I saw how much it affected the product. And I saw that this was mobilizing a industry in which not only were the consequences of technology unintended but causing harm, but also willfully ignored and causing harm. And I wanted to better understand and intervene into that culture to allow for a technological environment that better served the diversity of human values, many of which are not related to profit.
And your focus now is around the humanistic approach to work. Why is this important to you and us as a workforce?
I think it goes back to what I said earlier that the major problems that we want to solve are not going to be solved using one perspective. that it really does require a diversity of perspectives. And, I think that I take the humanities to task in many ways for developing a curriculum in a 21st century where most people go to college in order to get a job, and they take out astronomical amounts of loans in order to be able to do so because the cost of tuition is also astronomical. I fault the humanities for saying, for the most part, we're just going to continue to teach things because they're interesting and good, not because they have any job relevance. I am sympathetic to wanting to teach things because they're interesting and good. And of course, I want to do that too. But I also have to recognize who my audience is and what they're going to college for. And I think that most rational actors in the 21st century who are going to college because they actually need to figure out how to make money from that degree afterward. And I am the unfortunate person in Berkeley on panels who has to go in and defend capitalism frequently. It's not a fun position to be in. But I'm not an anti-capitalist as much as I, critique some of the profit motivations. I think that we have to be able to give our students the opportunity to make money once they graduate. Otherwise, we're just teaching to people, who have trust funds. But STEM curriculum took a very different route, understanding mid 20th century that the demographic of people who were going to college was changing dramatically in the United States. In the 1940s, the college community, which had primarily prior to that moment been people who had come from wealthier backgrounds, experienced an influx of people coming to college on the GI Bill after the end of World War II. And for those coming to college in the wake of the GI Bill after World War II were going to college in order to get a degree that would allow them to go from a blue collar upbringing frequently to a white collar upbringing so that they could build a house and build a family in the house. And a thinker at Stanford in the engineering department devised in that particular moment what he called the STEM curriculum. This is what we know as the STEM curriculum today. What he did to build that was he talked to industry in Silicon Valley, and he spent a lot of time dialoguing with them about what skills a new undergraduate going into their first job would need in order to be successful in that job. And based on what those conversations indicated to him, he created a curriculum that blended entrepreneurship or applied entrepreneurship with technical skills. And that's how we have a 4-year degree in STEM that leads newly graduated engineers to have the exact skills they need for their first job. And the humanities, in the meantime, said, what do we care whether our graduates get a job or not? We'll just train them to think in interesting ways. Now, I think that in the 21st century, a new model of education would allow people who have an approach to thinking about the world that's critically bound up in questions of what's good for humanity, or what are human beings actually like, or what values do we want to build toward, and have those folks trained with enough information about what technical approaches and building technical objects is like, such that they can go into industry and they can bring those questions, badly needed questions about what are human beings like? How do we think about the diversity of values that we want to build toward? And animate the industry with those questions. You can't do that if you don't know anything about technology, but you also can't build technologies that support and help to foster human values if you don't know what human beings are like. And I think that many of us just intuitively believe that because we are a human being, we know what human beings are fundamentally like. But of course, anybody who studies psychology knows that actually most of us don't know what human beings are like. We don't even know what we're like, right? That it actually takes immense amounts of training to be able to really deliberate those questions and to find good answers to those questions. I'd like to see people who have mastery of those questions also building things or
Yeah.
involved in the building process.
And I think a lot of us come from a viewpoint of it's a research group of one. I think this way, therefore everyone thinks this way. And my mother's like this, so all mothers are like that. And my friends are like this, so all friends are like that. And there's almost a blanket approach that we often take to judging people. Um, and the other thing I was
Yeah.
thinking, sorry, the other thing I was thinking about when you're chatting is it seems to be a real mismatch between the humanities side of education, who are looking just really to approach education from one perspective, and then the Silicon Valley or the technology side, which is really all about capitalism. And there seems to be a real mismatch between those two, education and the actual practical, this is what we need in a technical job environment.
Yeah, and I think that, look, I I want people to read Shakespeare, not because Shakespeare is informative or educational, but because he's great. He's just great, right? I want people to think about Freud not because Freud will allow somebody to get a job one day, right? As I understand it, Freud is no longer au courant in the psychology profession, but because he's fascinating. I want people to be able to do that, but I also want people to have the opportunity to explore these things and not do it at the cost of being active and upwardly mobile in the economy. And I want people to be able to do it as first generation students. And as a first generation student, if your educational path does not put you on the road to financial independence and financial mobility, then I think that we as a society, and certainly we as the humanities, have not done a good thing. And so I think that there should be some attention to how to navigate those tensions. And from my view, one approach to that is reforming undergraduate education to provide a better blend of those things. And I think that a better blend of those things will not only help the academy and help to ensure that, disciplines like English and history don't completely vacate themselves of enrollment, but I think it is formative to thinking about how to build a better technological industry. Look, I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. Um, those who are on the platform Facebook, now the parent company Meta, know that the first screen you get when you sign up says Facebook is doing what? Connecting the world, connecting the world. Now, I grew up in the United States in an upper class suburb. And in the context of an upper class suburb, what connecting the world meant when Facebook came out and I was in my last year of college was that I could connect with my family around the world. And for the first time, I was able to retain connections with people whom I might otherwise have lost connections to as I was departing college and as we were all dispersing. And I could reconnect with my high school and middle school friends, right? That's what connecting the world meant to me. But connecting the world meant something very different on January 6th, when a bunch of political dissidents who had malignant and malicious ideas about attacking the Capitol connected over Facebook in order to mobilize an insurrection. Connecting the world means something very different if you are in a country that has a genocidal agenda underway, as was the case in Myanmar, where people use Facebook to connect militants to one another and to ultimately mobilize a genocide. So, from my perspective, Mark Zuckerberg might have been better served with somebody who understood the history of ideas and somebody who had some understanding of geopolitics and what the idea of connecting the world might mean in places other than wealthy suburbs. So, I think about that and I think about how important it is to build things with those kinds of perspectives in mind, because these are not out of the box unintended consequences of this technology. These are obvious ways in which this technology will be misused by bad actors. Do I think that technologists should be responsible for every single way in which a person, bad actor, mobilizes their technology in a bad disaster? No. As with any other product of human invention, including philosophy, bad thinkers will take philosophies, well-intended, thoughtful, productive philosophies in bad directions. But do I think that it's worth sitting around as you're exporting a technology that's going to make massive product and become embedded in the social fabric of pretty much every single country in the world? Is there a moment where, as you start to build that technology and as it starts to become global, you might want to have somebody with the history of ideas and a sense of psychology and some geopolitical awareness building that technology with you? Yeah. And do I think there's a responsibility to think about possible misuses that are foreseeable and to build protections into it? Yes, I do.
So, do you think education then is about teaching people to think in in specific ways in terms of challenging their own mindsets and thinking beyond just their own viewpoints and thinking about the way other people see things and unintended consequences of actions? So, yes, it might
Yeah.
be about reading Freud and reading Shakespeare and investigating things, but an approach that helps them think differently to just a very generic, single-minded way that they may have been thinking about before.
I think ideally, universities should be a combination of applied skills that have some sort of employment possibility, future possibility attached to them, and critical thinking skills, including civil discourse. The subject matter does not matter all that much. I think that any subject should do this. And look, if they put me in charge, which nobody will ever do, but if they put me in charge, I would rethink the educational model that we have inherited from Alexander von Humboldt in the 18th and 19th century. um, I would readapt that for a 21st century model. And one thing I would do is I would say, we're not going to have somebody spend 4 years as an English major anymore, or as a bio major anymore, or as a computer science major anymore. We're going to train somebody to think about a problem in the world, and we're going to train them from a variety of different perspectives so that they don't have the kind of 4 year narrow track, but the kind of track that would, as I explained earlier, when it comes to something like COVID, allow somebody to tackle that kind of problem. So, for example, I think maybe we have a climate change studies major. What does somebody learn in climate change studies major? Well, they learn the technical and technological mechanisms that are at stake in building new climate tech, but they also learn the history of the climate movement, and they read Rachel Carson, and they read, Henry David Thoreau, and they also understand and read the history of the political and geopolitical movement around climate. And they also understand the individual psychologies associated with consumption, and with conservation, right? And so I think when you train people to have a 360 view of a particular problem, they can go in an industry equipped with the skills to make a difference, but also with the broad knowledge to be able to make that kind of difference in a way that is suited to the real multitude and multi-layered sense in which we live in the problem. Look, I think that climate change scientists were limited by the fact that many of them understood the science, but they did not understand human psychology, and they didn't understand the politics that were surrounding the science that they were delivering. And so I think that climate change as a field of study and climate change as a phenomenon that we are encountering would have been better served if climate scientists had had a better understanding of the environment in which they were delivering their findings. And I think that those people in the climate movement, in terms of people who are politically active, or people who are demanding justice, or are activists, would also be better served if, frankly, they had an understanding of the science and how difficult it is to create a clean energy infrastructure, and what that actually looks like in terms of phasing out fossil fuels, and what the politics of that are, so that we have people who can be advocates, but who are also informed about how to move that advocacy forward, given the environment that we're in and the technological limitations that we have.
So just thinking about that from a kind of having someone who's a critical, divergent, strategic thinker coming out of education environments, it kind of takes us back to what you were saying earlier about generative AI, and I'd love to chat about that now. So you also involved in work in Gen AI and building large language models. Can you talk more about this and why are you doing this kind of work around generative AI?
Yeah, well, I do this kind of work first and foremost because I'm a textual scholar. And increasingly, what generative AI means is that more and more of our world is going to be based on two things. The first is the existing corpus of texts on which all of these objects are trained. And second of all, the output of these models, which is more and more textuality and more language. And so, as a person of language and texts, this interests me, and I think that I have some things to say about what it looks like to generate worlds out of text and what some of the problems are of looking at the corpus of text that already exists and then remediating them and pushing forward our ideas based on only the limited data set. Now, what's really important to remember about these products is that they fundamentally cannot generate a new idea, at least not yet. What they do is they look at the data that they have been trained on, all of the data accumulated from the past, or what we like to think of as generally much of the entirety of the internet when it comes to a model like ChatGPT, which is a proprietary model. And what that output will be is some reformulation of the texts that already exist. Now, I already mentioned Shakespeare, and he is very beloved to me, and his work is very beloved to me. And the problem about this is that generally new ideas, what we call genius, doesn't come out of parroting back a version of what somebody else or the variety of voices on the internet or the collective voice of the internet has already said. What we think of as genius is the idea that there's an actually new way of thinking or new idea introduced. This is actually formative in how we think about what genius is, right? And to make this point, just make a distinction for you between what we think of as the child prodigy and the genius. A child prodigy is a prodigy when that child can draw like Van Gogh, or they can play a piano concerto like Mozart, right? Or that person can write a poem like Shakespeare at 4 years old. But what we think of as genius is fundamentally different. We look at a 45-year-old who can play piano just like Mozart, and we say that's cute. Or a 45-year-old who can do a nice reproduction of Van Gogh's sunflowers and say, oh, that's cute. But what Shakespeare's genius was not his ability to recreate Samuel Johnson, or somebody, who he had been very indebted to, in terms of his artistic output. What Shakespeare's genius was that at the time he wrote Romeo and Juliet, the idea of romantic love did not exist in the culture yet. It just didn't exist. People got married to one another based on, formal arrangements by families that were essentially property or business arrangements. And that was that. But when Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, so thoroughly did he animate the idea of romantic love, and so brilliantly did he describe that idea and stage it for public that today, hundreds of years later, our proper noun for romantic love is still Romeo and Juliet. And what he did was introduce this idea to culture. And I am not so naive or so arrogant as to think that we have thought of all of the great ideas yet. I still think that there's great ideas to come. We're not going to get those ideas if what we do is we use tools that have availability of the entire corpus of what people have already thought and reproduce that. The human genius element is what we add to the culture beyond the data that we have already been trained on or that we've learned from. That's something that these models can't do yet. And so I fear that we're going to lose that. And thinking in that way is one of the reasons that I want to help people understand what these tools can do and what they can't do, and what we still need to do as humans in terms of writing and thinking on our own, that negate our dependence, our total dependence on these tools. And my hopes that we can continue to think as human beings have always thought, creatively with these tools as tools, right? Not as the creative mechanism in of itself. Now, my work on large language models is steeped in these ideas. But what I was actually doing in the context of developing my own model and thinking about developing my own platform was actually being adversarial to these models and seeing what kinds of guardrails protect the uh, general public from things that bad users can do with these models that could fundamentally cause harm. And so to briefly describe the stakes of that project, first have to make a distinction between the large language models that many of your listeners are probably familiar with, which are what I call proprietary models. ChatGPT, for example, is a proprietary model. And what that means is that a business has developed this model and they have developed it using their technologists that, for the most part, the technology itself is managed by the people in that business. And because the technology is managed by people in that business, they have the opportunity to put guardrails around it. So, for example, if you ask ChatGPT to produce a stereotype of a particular religious group, it will not do that because it has a safeguard built into it to train it to not produce that stereotype. If you ask ChatGPT to help you build a bomb, it will not do that because it has that protection built into it. The alternative to proprietary models is what are called open source or open weight models. And those models are available for people to download and to put into their own product, right? And those models have far fewer safeguards built around them. And in fact, they're more susceptible to what's called jailbreaking or people using persuasive prompts the same way that you might use a persuasive technique to get somebody to do something that their better judgment tells them not to do. You can actually use those same persuasive techniques to get these models to produce content that they ought not to be able to do. And because they don't have the safeguards of proprietary models, they will do that with some relative ease and with some really harmful content as the output. And so my work was looking to see what kinds of prompts create the opportunity for these models to be used in harmful ways by bad actors, and thinking about the larger problem of what are the benefits and what are the harms to open source and open weight models vis-a-vis proprietary models, given that open source is celebrated in our culture as a democratized form of technology. Um, I wanted to ask the question, okay, we have this technology, it's democratized in the sense that you can have wide participation. The public can inspect and intervene into the models themselves, but we lose some safeguards. And what the outcome is a fundamental shift, not just in the democracy of creating technologies, but in the democracy and the democratic fabric as the output of these models go into the broader discourse. And so, what are the trade-offs between democratized forms of technological creation and what we actually want these models to be able to do and to not be able to do?
I'm assuming then if there's a lot more people using open source models instead of ChatGPT, that they might be susceptible or opening themselves up to some kind of abuse or some kind of negative actors or bad actors who are kind of going to influence them or have a negative impact on them. Do you think there's going to be a lot more of those open source models being used going forward rather than ChatGPT?
I think that probably ChatGPT is a technology that the general public is going to primarily use. Right now, at least, I don't think that it takes an enormous amount of technological skill to wrap a model into an API. That just means a platform where the model is usable, and then allow people to then access it, or to allow an elite group to create and spit out a broad amount of content in ways that can be deeply impactful to our general discourse. I'll give you one example. The model that I was building was a model that would create uh, speech that was extremist that could be used to recruit extremists. And one of the things about extremism is that extremism and extremist recruitment looks at and is susceptible to forms of persuasion, some of the same forms of persuasion that these models are susceptible to as well. I think that probably, at least for right now, the majority of folks are going to continue to use a model like ChatGPT because the queries that they want for the most part, the general public, to ask ChatGPT are not necessarily queries that ChatGPT won't respond to, right? Where do I get the best pizza in this place that I'm traveling next weekend, right? What did my boyfriend mean when he sent me that text? Those are things that ChatGPT will answer with full relish, but there is, I think, a small contingent of people who can do enormous amounts of damage using these models because of the vast capability of these models to create not only just massive amounts of content, but content that can be targeted toward specific individuals and specific communities with horrendous effect. So, for example, think about a white nationalist group that wants to infiltrate a specific community and has a large amount of propaganda that it can send to that community, knowing what that specific community's ambitions and fears are. And I'm talking about a community online where people gravitate around a specific issue, right? That model can really fully and in a very targeted way understand how that community talks, how it thinks, what it's concerned about, and create content that can mobilize extremism within that particular community. Think about how that could be used globally to horrific and violent effect. And so I'm not concerned that the majority of people are going to go to open weight, open source models. I just don't think that the bang is worth the buck for most people. But I do think that the impact of open source models that don't have safeguards and guardrails built around them can be massively impactful for a small group of people using them to create political forms of persuasion that can move people toward violence or can move people toward political positions that they might not otherwise hold. I mean, consider a more innocuous form of this, which is that say that a particular interest group does not want gun legislation passed in the United States, right? Well, one tactic they could use is to create a large letter campaign using a large language model to inundate Congress people with targeted letters from constituents that may or may not actually exist, to make the politicians who are going to be voting on this issue believe that there is an outsourced issue, outsourced amount of attention to this issue and a vision for how the individuals want their representatives to vote represented in their constituency. How might that change our politics over time? How might that change the things that get enacted into laws over time? So you can, these are just a few examples of how a mechanism that can be leveraged to put out massive amounts of content can change what's called the Overton window, which is the window of things that we consider to be normal and accepted in our society, and move them in directions of a particular political interest or a particular interest of somebody who wants their own particular political vision to dominate our society.
Yeah, so it's kind of the niche groups that are thinking in a very specific way and have a very specific worldview and are biased already towards a specific idea or concept. And the potential is that it could really be more harmful than the echo chambers of social media currently.
Look, in our social media, what the algorithms attach to is what seems most interesting to us. And what we understand of our society is not any longer how many people believe something, but how much textuality or how much informational attention is given to a certain idea. And one way to manipulate the sense that we have of how people think in our society is to flood the platform or to flood a informational ecosystem with text and information that suggests that a particular point of view has more credence or credibility or popularity than it actually does. And what we are already seeing is the ways in which this particular mechanism and quirk of our informational ecosystem has been used to the benefit of extremists or has defaulted to promoting extremist views. This is already on the rise, and there's an enormous opportunity, I think, and we should be very concerned about the ways in which extremist groups can use the benefit of technologies that can produce massive amounts of new textuality to change the Overton window and the balances of our ecosystem in their favor.
And also then thinking about students and education in general, because there's a lot of students now who are using generative AI to help them with it, writing essays or kind of doing research. Do you think there's going to be a real divide between going forward between those who use their brain to do critical thinking and writing essays and writing letters and wrestling with text and copy, to those who use generative AI to kind of build their essay and do some element of copy and paste with a bit of editing?
I mean, I think that um, this depends on a lot of things. And one of the things that it depends on is what the university decides it's training students to do. I think that, you know, right now I'm writing a piece on AI governance in education. And one of the things that becomes apparent when you look at the technologies that are introduced to higher education is that so few of them are actually connected to educational missions, right? So I'll give you an example of one such technology, and then I'll go back to your question about generative AI. If you look at the original mission of education, which I still think still stands, it is to create critical thinkers and rational actors and people who are able to understand the environment and to be able to be thoughtful, philosophical people in response to that environment. And I think that no matter what you do coming out of college, that's what college should fundamentally do, right? That is the basis of training anybody to have any form of employment whatsoever. But then, you look at what our technologies actually allow us to evaluate about a student. And around, I would say maybe early 2000s, one of the student demands seemed to be that they get credit for participation. And pedagogically, that seems rational. You want to include the amount of effort and how a student is showing up in their grade. And so, okay, now it's not just going to be writing the essay, but it's also going to be how somebody participates in class. Well, okay, now you've got to track how somebody participates in class. And when online learning systems become a thing, now you've got to track how somebody is moving. And so somebody will sell you software that allows you to track that with much more accuracy and to be able to provide a record for it. Good. So now you've got an online learning management system that allows you to track attendance. And now you're able to enter that into the grade. And since students care about their grades, now they're tracking their attendance. And then you have the movement to, for example, Zoom classes. And it's not enough now to just track whether or not somebody signs in to the Zoom. You actually have to track whether or not they're doing something active. And so now you have to do something like record whether or not somebody's camera is on. And so now what you're tracking is whether or not somebody's camera is on. And when you know it, there's a uh, socio-technical system that somebody who's created the software can now sell to a university that allows you to track whether or not somebody's camera is on. But now we have the problem that, well, actually a student can have their camera on and be looking at their screen, but actually, reading what's going on social media or watching a YouTube video. And so now, wouldn't you know it, a software system has a socio-technical system that they can sell you that will track somebody's eyeballs and their eye movement on the screen. And so now what you're tracking is somebody's eyeball movements on the screen so that you can track their attendance so that you can somehow through this long chain of things get back to whether or not you're accomplishing an educational mission. And this is again a form of mission drift, right? It's enabled by somebody who has created a product that they will sell you, right? Um, and so there's a motivation to use a product that has been already sold to university, end up tracking things that just have no bearing on what education is ultimately supposed to be about. Now, I think that in higher education, instructors are at a loss about what to do. And so there are more and more mechanisms put in place to track and police whether or not students are actually using these tools, or whether they're actually, instead doing the kinds of thought processes that they're supposed to be doing in assignments. So I think that we're at a really critical stage right now where we need to ask ourselves to go back to basics and say, what is education fundamentally supposed to be about? Not are the students using these tools or not, and how can I police and track it? But what is this education is supposed to be about? And given these tools exist, and given that students are going to use them, what can I do to fundamentally get back to these educational goals that I am liable to and that I'm committed to. And to be sure, universities and technology companies have not done anybody any favors by just giving us this technology that nobody really asked for and then saying, adapt to it. And by the way, we're not going to give you any extra resources or time or decrease your workload in any other way in order for you to come up with a new educational system and its new set of principles and values that are going to allow you to teach the educational principles that are important to you now, given this new intrusion of this new technology. So, that I think is worth noting that nobody asked for this technology and nobody has given anybody any time or any mercy in accommodating it. But I think that if we go back to basics and say, what is this educational process actually about? Somebody who's teaching writing essays might come up with an assignment that looks like this. Take my prompt, run it through ChatGPT, print out what ChatGPT says, and then I want you to write an essay telling me why ChatGPT is insufficient to answering this prompt in a way that connects with the content of this class and all of the lectures that we have undertaken over the past, 15 weeks. And that's not something that ChatGPT is going to be able to respond to, right? And what you're asking students to do in that particular moment is not just to spit out the original thought, but to actually make distinctions intellectually themselves between what this tool can provide and what it can't provide. So that's an opportunity to learn right there. Now, I think that there's one other, I want to say, silver lining to this, which is that a lot of the assignments that I think instructors were using are actually stale. The essay is not a 5 paragraph word salad as it so frequently is conceived of in educational settings. The essay fundamentally was invented in order to propose a scientific method to our belief system. So what was happening at the time that the essay was invented? Well, it was a scientific revolution. And everywhere, thinkers who were not so narrowly defined as we do now in terms of discipline, were thinking about how we understand the world and how we respond to and give causality to the environment and the phenomena in that environment around us. And so the scientific method said, take a hypothesis, conduct an experiment, identify your evidence for whether or not the experiment proved or disproved your hypothesis, and then deliberate at the end of that new inroads for new possibilities or ways of thinking about something, and then new questions that you want to ask as a result of this experiment. That's what the scientific method was meant to do. And what the essay was meant to do was to ask us to apply the same process to our beliefs. How do we know what we know? What are our axioms and premises? What evidence do we have for these beliefs? How do we logically think through them using the scientific method toward our conclusions? And what, given our conclusions, ought we to ask next? What new inroads of thinking are available to us now that we have demonstrated the logic of our thoughts and the evidence that proves that logic to our thoughts? That's what an essay is. You have three, I think the common wisdom is that there has to be 3 sentences to a paragraph. Well, that's not arbitrary. It's because one sentence sets up the proposition or the thesis of that paragraph, one sentence at least to announce the evidence, and one sentence to interpret and analyze that evidence, right? That's why you have 3 sentences. Well, ask a, undergraduate, why do we have 3 sentences? I don't think they'll be able to tell you that because we haven't taught what the essay is fundamentally supposed to do as an object of thought and as a catalyst for thought. We just teach it as write 5 paragraphs telling us, some messy, messy meandering sense of, what you think the teacher thinks about this topic. And I think that this is, again, an opportunity for us to move away from the stalemates that we've got ourselves in terms of thinking a certain way about what thought is supposed to look like and really interrogate the basic premise of what thought is, what textuality is, what writing is supposed to do to us and for us. And if we use that opportunity wisely, I think that we maybe have in this moment an opportunity to reconnect with its value for us as thinkers and as humans acting in the world.
I think you're right. A lot of university essays are about, as you say, a word salad of you taking different texts or different information and kind of throwing it together in a way that you think sort of flows or may be logical or may answer the question. But actually, we don't really, a lot of students don't really think about the process of writing an essay from that perspective that you've spoken about with these 3 sentences per paragraph. It's a really great way of putting it out there. And the other thing I was thinking about is there's a lot of universities who are wrestling with this whole large language model, ChatGPT, generative AI concept. And there's so much debate about how it will actually be involved in education, especially tertiary education going forward at college and university. Do you think we're at a real divide in terms of how we teach students in general? And do you think a lot of there will also be a divide between universities who kind of go down the route that you're talking about, where we challenge thinking and we teach students to actually think, versus those who kind of shut down the whole concept of use of technology in terms of generative AI use in education. Um, so all I'm trying to find out from you, or the question I'm trying to ask is, do you think there's going to be a real divide between universities that shun any generative AI use and those who kind of use it to help people think more critically, more um, strategically, more innovatively?
Well, I don't actually see any universities shunning it, mostly because I think that they understand their own impotence in the face of this technology. I mean, shunning it would be, like shouting into the void in a sense, right? Students are going to use this technology, and by the way, so are professors, no matter what your policy is. I do think that there will be a divide between disciplines that make the decision to teach this and to teach digital literacy around it, and disciplines that say we're just going to cover our eyes and ears and hope that nothing changes, right? Or what we're going to do is instead of um, thinking about how we want to teach this technology, we're just going to go back to blue books, or we're just going to go back to oral exams because then students can't use this to cheat. Again, like I don't think that the purpose of a academic environment is to police students cheating. It's unfortunately something that all of us have had to learn how to do in academia. But that's not why I became a professor. I didn't become a professor so that I could distinguish between whether or not a student wrote a paper themselves or whether they had somebody else write it for them or used some sort of technological tool to fool me, right? That's not why I became a professor. I became a professor to help students think better about their environment. And this isn't our environment now. And so I think that disciplines that make the decision and come up with strategic ways to invite thinking about this technology as part of their curriculum are in a better position to have the opportunity to educate people who are going into this environment and who are going to be using these technologies to do them in ways that are aligned with the object of study for that discipline.
It sounds like there's going to be a real watershed in education going forward between those who are really embracing it from your perspective or how you see it, and those who kind of using it, as you say, and I use the word shun just because it's kind of, as you say, going down the route of, well, you have to do an oral exam, so no, you're not cheating.
Yeah, I don't know that there's that huge divide. There are moments where I am grateful for ChatGPT, or I actually don't use ChatGPT to be honest. I ask ChatGPT questions about what the text messages or emails that are sent to me mean. I use Anthropic, which has a product called Claude that I think is a much better research tool and much more sophisticated and better model. And I will say that it's much more sophisticated and better in my view because it is principled in trust and safety. And I don't use Claude because I like its principles. I use it because it's a better tool. And I think it's a better tool because it cares about important principles. And so it's designed with those principles as its foundation. As just a side note, but I am grateful for the use of a large language model to help me do some of my work. And I'm frustrated by it at times and frustrated by the way that, it makes me sometimes move away from my original principles or stances in the form of mission drift. I'm frustrated by the way that the emphasis on textual productivity has seemed to be prioritized over an emphasis on the depth or the originality uh, or the importance of thought. And I am very saddened by the impact that's sure to be seen, I think, relatively soon in terms of the environment, because AI tools are not just very powerful, they're also very power hungry. So there are things that are frustrating for me about these tools, and there are things that are exciting for me about these tools. I don't, for myself, think about it as either good or bad. I think about it as, okay, how do we maximize and harness what is good about this? And minimize the harms, including the harms caused by tools that allow us to process and think differently, right? In terms of our cognitive approaches to and our perception of the world.
And I'd love to chat about your recent appointment at the as the Siegel Research Fellow at All Tech is Human. Firstly, can you talk about the foundation and the work of All Tech is Human, their mission, goals, and the community they're building? And secondly, what work and research you're involved with them?
Yeah, sure. All Tech is Human as an organization is, I think, one of the most important organizations currently operating mostly in the United States, but at this stage also globally, in building a community of people interested in responsible technology and the future of responsible technology. And so its power is both as a brain trust, aggregate of people who flock to All Tech is Human, um, for thought leadership, but also as community, people who are curious and interested in thinking about technology through a responsible aperture or lens, and who want to be part of a movement. And so All Tech is Human is really formative in getting people together to think about these things and to distributing ideas relevant to that kind of thesis, which is to say, how do we build a more responsible tech ecosystem? My work with All Tech is Human, supported by Siegel Endowment, um, and the generous fellowships that they offered me, is really pivoted around a strain of my work dedicated to thinking about how we build a new workforce at the frontier of responsible technology and what it takes in order to build educational structures that will allow people to think about technology in responsible ways, and then also how we understand the job market in that particular area. And I started tracking the job market in responsible tech in about 2016. And just to provide a little bit of intellectual history, 2016 was a really important moment in the tech industry. In the United States, it was a moment at which the election of Donald Trump drew new scrutiny and new attention to some of the ways in which technological products were causing social harm, including, and I don't take a political position as to the outcome of that election, but I think many people, regardless of how they felt politically, were surprised by and concerned by the fact that Facebook as a platform through Cambridge Analytica had actually changed the outcome of that election through political advertising and through the sale and the distribution and harvesting of personal data, to persuade people to take up political positions that they might not have otherwise held in a way that ultimately had outcomes for the future of American democracy. And so I think many people were newly concerned about this, and were also newly concerned about what the leaders in the tech industry were doing with the enormous amount of capital, and also political capital that they had amassed in a moment where the administration elected in 2016 had also promised to deport workers, for example. Well, tech workers are high skill workers, but people who work at tech companies include people who run the cafeterias and clean the floors. And so the entire ecosystem is also dependent on immigrant labor. And so there are real questions, for example, and I'm just giving one small example of how tech leaders were using their political capital in order to speak up for important social values, or whether they were going to do that. And if we go back to that 2016 moment, We think about, the Obama era's kind of excited celebration of tech leadership and tech innovation. Obama era was a era of kind of celebrating our tech oligarchs. And suddenly this concern, along with concern about things like deep fakes, started to emerge in the environment right around the election, if folks recall, there was one clip that was particularly startling of what looked like President Obama speaking, saying things that he would never otherwise say in a video clip that looked seamless. In fact, it was Jordan Peele voicing Obama with the video manipulated to look like Obama was speaking. This is probably in our 2025 vision, not particularly startling, but in 2016 it was. And so in 2016, people started to ask about what kinds of practices tech companies were including in their ecosystem and whether or not those practices were going to align with human values. And in response to that, tech companies started to hire a number of responsible tech roles. For example, Salesforce in 2017 created a new position called Chief Ethical Officer. And we started to see those roles kind of multiply in the industry, a lot of them focused on DEI, and in particular, a couple of years later, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, focusing on questions of diversity, equity, inclusion in the tech industry. That initial impulse to create responsible tech movement and responsible tech work in industry has gone through multiple iterations since then, which I'm happy to talk more about if we have time. But my work is really looking at that movement from 2016, 2017, and then looking at the growth of the job market in that industry, the evolutions that it has undertaken at particular pivot points, including 2022 with the Biden era um, bill on civil rights, the response to, for example, GDPR, uh, a response to industry contraction as well in 2022 with Elon Musk buying, at the time, Twitter, now X, and laying off a bunch of trust and safety people, all the way up to today in the Trump administration and the ways in which tech leaders corresponding with the Trump administration maybe setting up new expectations and new anti-regulatory positions that will have consequences for this market and for the people who are currently or hope to be employed in a responsible tech form of work.
What are the most pressing ethical challenges in today's technological landscape, taking all that into account?
Well, this might seem like a kind of ambulatory answer, but I would say that for me, the most pressing issues are actually not issues of the technology itself, but the profit motives and the financial incentives around the technologies. There's a very common saying, a man will not do anything. For some reason, the saying is always a man. A man will not do anything that is not aligned with the benefits for his pocketbook. And I think I equally accept the similar saying that, show me what your incentives are, and I'll show you what whatever you're building will look like ultimately. And the incentives are profit, and the profit is extensive. And I'll give you an example of where I think this matters. If you are CEO of a company and your company is a publicly funded company or a public company, it's gone through an IPO, you are beholden to your shareholders for the decisions that you make. And so there's a financial uh, sense in which your profit motive has to be the primary obligation. Never mind that people are hired for the position of CEO not because they're particularly contemplative thinkers about the social impact of their product, but because they know how to bring a product to market in order for that product to be maximally successful. And so you look at the financial incentive structure behind the technological industry and you look at the massive amount of profit that stands to be made by it. And you look at the all of the directives that undergird any object of technology itself. And if you're a CEO of a company and you have your business and sales team saying, we need to make, 5% growth minimum this year. And your ethics team says, well, if you do this thing that's going to get you to 5% growth, here are all of the consequences of that, and here are all the populations that are potentially going to get harmed. And here are recommendations. By the way, the recommendations that we're putting in place is going to cost you 7% growth. And you're the CEO. Do you listen to your ethics team or do you listen to your business team? Well, of course you listen to your business team and you say, all right, we'll apologize later for this, right? That's the incentive structure that's set up. And so I think that in that point of view, and in the absence of regulation, which when instituted correctly and thoughtfully, can actually create fair competition across different companies, such that they don't have to undertake malignant business practices or cause harm in order to be competitive on the market. Absent those regulations, our opportunity is to find ways in which an ethical point of view can be sold in a way that makes a business case, right? And that's a, I think, unfortunate point of view. And look, again, as the person in Berkeley who's frequently put on panels to defend capitalism, I will say that this is not an attack on capitalism. I think some people will dismiss what I have to say out of hand because they say, well, she just doesn't believe that businesses should make money to begin with. I believe that businesses should make money to begin with. That is the job of a business. I understand that. But what I say to entrepreneurs, and what I say when anybody asks me to give a talk on this, is that you can do good and do well. There, there need not be any compromise between those things. And in fact, there is a business case for doing good because in an age when there is no regulation and when people are mistrustful of the ways in which technologies and technological companies will take advantage of them, if you can produce a platform and a product that does good or is protective, that isn't predatory in terms of its approach to capitalism, that doesn't depend on unhealthy forms of surveillance, or that doesn't, introduce or that helps protect people against financial fraud or data harvesting that's unwanted. You have a market advantage. People want that. That's why I think that Anthropic will do well. Because not because they're particularly principled and people will flock to them because they care about the ethics of Anthropic, but because the ethics are so thoughtfully induced and built into the product, that the product will be a better product and that people want to use it because it's a better product. So again, you can do well and do good. I'm not here to give you an anti-capitalist screed, but what I am here to say is that when our profit motives are divorced from or cannot be aligned with responsible motivations, um, unfortunately, in our society, the business motives will move out. And I think that it's not just about the harms that these technologies will cause. It's about the lost opportunities because so many of the technologies or the technological capabilities being introduced right now could do tremendous things in terms of solving problems in the world. But I don't think that for the most part, the fundamental problems are that profitable to solve. And instead, what we will, I think, and what we are already seeing, what we will see, what I think we're seeing is that the technologies will be harnessed toward the most profitable and not the most productive solutions for our society. And so, you see these tremendously powerful AI products that I do think have tremendous potential being funneled into products that help businesses send better marketing emails, right? Not to, uh, for example, thinking about how these AI products can help create better drugs for rare diseases.
What do you think the future, or what do you hope the future looks like with the digital human in your very specific field of ethical and human technology?
My hope is that it looks like an opportunity for people who wouldn't otherwise have access to these technologies to have access to the technologies, and for people who need to create solutions in their own communities to use these technologies. And my hope is that when that's the case, their input will be included into the technologies themselves. Now, I'm not sometimes people look at me and look at what I do and say, all of you responsible tech people, you're just Luddites. You just don't like technology. I love technologies. I think technologies are great. I just want to build ones that better serve the diversity of human values and the diversity of ways of living in this world. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. Most of our technologies, I think, are built with the basic axiomatic assumption that what we want to build toward is greater efficiency. That's the ambition behind something like ChatGPT. How do we make something more efficient? Conveniently, that's the logic of capitalism, which also means that these technological objects have a better chance of making money when they make something more efficient. But we all know that when we live in this world, we live for other things and for other purposes than doing something efficiently, right? I had a meal with my best friend last night, and we sat down to that meal, and we did not drink a glass of Soylent each so that we could get back to our computers and have an efficient meal. We sat down and I made a four-course meal for my friend because I wasn't trying to make our time together more efficient. I was trying to create a setting where we could dwell in intimacy and where we could have pleasure in the things that we're eating. We all know that we don't eat so that we can be maximally efficient and chug down maximally efficient nutritional delivery systems. We eat for pleasure. We eat because we want to share a moment of intimacy with somebody else as we break bread. We eat because something reminds us of the recipe that our mother made for us when we were 7 years old, and that sensory connection with the taste of something brings us back to a formative moment in our lives. So there's so many different reasons why we exist in this world other than to be efficient. And my hope is that with democratic input and with the democratization of some of these tools, we can have input from people who understand the diversity of human values and that we have an intellectually diverse group of people creating these technologies to begin with so that they can provide an input, an understanding of who human beings actually are, why we're here, what we want, what different people may want that maybe we ourselves do not, and so that we can build technologies that better serve us.
So, how can we as individuals contribute to promoting ethical practices in our everyday interactions with technology?
I think it's just on a certain individual level, it's being thoughtful about how we engage with this technology. Is this technology helping me further my goals as a person today, or is it actually circumventing something important to me? To go back to Facebook, right? One premise embedded in this idea of connecting the world is that more connections are better for us. That if we just connect to more people, then we'll be happier, right? Then we'll feel more connected. Well, anybody who spends their life on social media or knows somebody who does knows that that's not the case. That it's not the number of connections we have, it's the depth of connection that we have. And so you can use that technology, sure, in ways that allow me to connect with my family in South Africa, for example, or in Australia. Um, but I also know that what I'm aiming to do is to use that technology to create a connection that will allow for depth. And that endlessly scrolling on Facebook or Instagram, which is what the platform is designed to get you to do because that's their profit motive, won't help you with the depth of connection. So, how can we maximally use the tools in a way that aligns with what we want to accomplish in this world? In many of my talks, I talk about the idea that, and this is not my idea, that our lives amount to what we pay attention to. That's it. What we pay attention to, therefore, is an ethical activity. We pay attention to things that matter to us. And so I think that there's a place for these tools. But how do these tools help us maximize what we intend to pay attention to, not what they intend us to pay attention to? And how do we use these tools to better hone in on the things that matter to us? How do we use those tools to maximize our attention to the things that we care about, right? And not, again, to the things that they care.
Yeah, so it's kind of becoming an agent again of our own lives and being more conscientious of what we do with the technology rather than just letting the technology use us in a way.
Right.
Yeah. Deb, we're coming to the end of our interview, and I was wondering one of the standard questions I normally ask is, what is the most important question I haven't asked you yet?
Hmm. The most important question that you have not asked me yet, I think has to do with, like the way that these technologies intersect with, I think, fundamental human dignity. One of the reasons that I got into responsible tech roles is that I think that what we do with our jobs really matters. A while ago, in researching this topic and also trying to understand better what my work is about, I spent time asking people why they worked, other than the paycheck. And the answers that I got were startling. Some people said that they really, you know, took a giant pay cut in order to work on things that they thought were going to have a massive amount of impact in the world. Some people gave me stories about their children and their child battling with a rare disease, and they wanted to work on a particular technology that they thought might ultimately one day provide a response to that form of disease. And I think that so many of us get caught up in mission drift. Why do I work? Well, sometimes when I'm having a hard time writing an article or a hard time getting myself together to go to class, it's because my reason for working that day is self-aggrandizement or the paycheck, right? I want to do this job or I want to write this book because I want more people to pay attention to me. I don't want to feel insignificant. I want to feel like I'm doing something that will get my name out so that I feel better about, who I am and I don't feel so insignificant. Um, that's not going to motivate your best work. What's going to motivate your best work is you feeling like, and I credit Jim Doty, a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon at Stanford, for providing me this thought. Um, what gets you the best work is you feeling like you are providing help and care and service to somebody else, and help and care and service and love to yourself, right? That that on a neurological level, we know that that matters. And I think that I want to create opportunities for people to continue along the lines of dignified work. People are very concerned about automation and the loss of jobs. I don't think that there's going to be a loss of jobs, but the jobs might be very different jobs. And they might not be jobs that people want to do that feel like they capture somebody's sense of dignity, what they feel that they're good at, what they want to contribute to the world. And so when I'm working on the responsible tech job market, in the back of my mind is, of course, in addition to how do we revolutionize the industry so that the industry itself is more attentive to the diversity of human values and more responsible to society. It's also true that I think a lot about how we create educational pipelines and reform education to do that. And these things are at the forefront of the work, but in the back of my mind is always how do we ensure that people go to work and they have a dignity in what they do, that they feel proud of what they get to do, that people graduate with degrees that put them in positions of dignity in their profession where they feel like they're valued and that their ideas matter, and that when they go to work, they're not just executing for some, soulless corporation that is building a product that they either don't believe in or think might be bad for society. But how do we create opportunities for people in industry, in public service, in civil society, in public interest to talk about and to build things that really matter to them and to go to work every day and believe that what they're doing is a reflection of an additive to their own sense of dignity and duty in the world? And so when I look at the future of work and I look at all the questions that come up about automation and I look at my own work in responsible technology, I never forget that this is also just about individual workers and individual workers going to work and being able to feel proud of what they do, being able to feel not only proud of what they do, but that they're able to provide for their families and for their futures, and that there is a sense of dignity wrapped around what we do when we spend our lives working and in particular in the 21st century, how that encounters with technology and how that can be an opportunity to build technologies in a way that is better for us, as well as to build jobs and a society through those jobs that is better for technology.
Yeah. So it sounds as though it's kind of finding meaningful work that also allows me to provide for my family and care for my family in a financial way. So it's kind of a both and in some ways.
That's the American dream, right?
Absolutely. And do you have any particular favorite book that's related to what you do and the ethics around digital human that you normally recommend to others to read?
I really like Kate Hales and her work on posthumanism. It's an oldie but a goodie, and Kate, I think more than any other thinker, has thought very much in depth about what it is like to be a human being in the age of tech, how our bodies and ourselves are changed by our encounters with technological products and how technologies themselves change in response to us being human. Her book, We Have Always Been Posthuman, I think is a good way of capturing this idea that we have always thought of ourselves as human beings as somehow separate from technologies. But in fact, we incorporate those technologies into our bodies and in our lives every day, and we always have, right? Think of the first humans who encountered fire. Um, that became part of the fabric of their society. You know, I wear contact lenses and I wear a piece of technology that changes my perception every day of my waking life. I've had 4 knee surgeries to deal with injury and disability, and so I have technologies in my knee. Every single moment I take a step, I'm using a technology. All of us most of us post pandemic have a antiviral in our bodies that protects us against, right, a new disease. And so this delusion that our technologies are somehow separate from us is precisely that. It is a delusion. It is an illusion. We have always been um, incorporative of our technologies. And I think Kate's work helps us to better understand that on a very fundamental level, and also to think about who we are as part technology, part human, as we always have been.
Yeah. And that's the thing, as we always have been, because a lot of us think of technology just as a smartphone or a smartwatch, but actually we've been using technology for eons, pretty much, yeah, since the dawn of time. Technology is
Yeah,
just helping, is something that'll help us to do something better.
a technology, the word technology comes from the Greek word techne. Techne, in Greek means to weave or to craft something. It's how we get our modern word textile. It's same root word. So techne is this concept, isn't some sort of like magical science thing, right? That appears to us in the 21st century as a kind of, magic trick. It is fundamentally something that we weave together, right? That we create. So that techne, that craft, that thing that is woven together, also, by the way, the root word of the uh, word text, which is language, has the basic capacity in it to help us understand. I think that at the very essence of technology is the idea of human craft and of weaving together something. And what is a woven thing? Well, a woven thing is the blend of the thing we create and the blend of us in that thing that we create. Technologies are reflections of and crafts of ourselves. They're woven into us and we are woven into them.
It's kind of an extension of ourselves beyond just our biological self. It's just an extension of ourself and how we kind of
Correct.
put ourselves forward.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Deb, thank you so much for joining me on Confessions of a Cyber Psychologist. It was so fabulous to catch up with you. You've given me so much to think about, and I've just been blown away about all your thoughts and your insights and how you see the world. And I really look forward to chatting to you again in the future.
Oh, thanks so much for the dialogue. It's been a lovely conversation.